My name is Michael Rourke. I was a senior chief sonar technician in the United States Navy for 22 years, and for the last 4 months I have been dying slowly enough to have time to think, and fast enough to know I don't have time to keep lying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The oncologist gave me a number back in March, and I won't repeat it here, because numbers like that stop mattering the moment you decide what you're going to do with whatever is left. What I decided to do is tell you what happened in the summer of 1997. 2,000 feet of steel and 17 men beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in water so deep that sunlight is a rumor the fish tell each other. I kept this for 29 years. I kept it through 2 marriages, through raising 3 kids who think their father spent the Cold War's aftermath doing nothing more exciting than punching holes in paperwork, through a retirement ceremony where an admiral shook my hand and thanked me for my quote-unquote unblemished service record. I kept it because I signed a piece of paper that told me I would lose my pension, my freedom, and possibly my life if I ever spoke about Operation Deep Listen. I am not afraid of losing my pension anymore. I am not afraid of losing my freedom. And as for my life, well, the cancer already has dibs on that, so the Navy is going to have to get in line behind it. I want to start before the story starts, because I think you need to understand who I was before you can understand what happened to me. I enlisted in 1981, 19 years old, from a town in Ohio you have never heard of and never will, because I am not going to tell you its name. My father worked a steel mill that was already dying when I was born, and I wanted out before it finished dying and took the whole town down with it. The Navy recruiter told me I had good ears, which is a strange thing to be told you have, but it turned out to be true. I tested high for sonar aptitude, went through basic at Great Lakes, and then to sonar tech school at Naval Submarine School in Groton, Connecticut. If you don't know what a sonar technician does, I'll explain it the way I used to explain it to my kids when they were small enough to still think their dad's job was interesting. Imagine you're in a pitch-black room, and the only way you can know what's in that room with you is by listening, not by clapping and hearing echoes, though that's part of it. That's active sonar, and we hardly ever used it, because it's like screaming your location into a dark room where something might be hunting you. Mostly, we listened. Passive sonar. Hydrophone arrays strung along the hull and towed behind the boat on a cable a mile long, picking up every sound the ocean had to offer. And the ocean has a lot to offer. Whale song. Shrimp snapping their claws in numbers so large it sounds like static. The groan of the hull compressing at depth. Distant merchant traffic, sometimes 1,000 miles away, bent and refracted by the layers of temperature and salinity, until it arrives at your headphones sounding like a ghost. And, if you were good, if you had the ears for it, the specific mechanical signature of another submarine trying very hard to be quiet. That was the job. Sit in a dark room lit only by a green waterfall display, wear a headset, and listen to the ocean until you can tell the difference between a fishing trawler 40 miles out and a Soviet Akula-class boat trying to sneak up behind your own. I was good at it. I don't say that to brag. I say it because it matters to the story. By 1988, I'd made first class. By 1994, I was a chief. I'd served on 3 fast-attack submarines by the time this happened. And I want to be specific here, because specificity is the only thing I have to offer you that a Hollywood writer couldn't invent from a library card. The boat was the USS Corvina, hull number SSN 798, a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine, and in the summer of 1997, I was her senior chief sonar technician, running a division of 11 sonar techs across 3 watch sections. I want you to picture the sonar shack, because I lived in that room more than I lived in my own rack. It's maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, crammed with consoles. The BQQ-5 sonar suite displays glowing green and amber in the dark, headphones hanging on hooks, a coffee mug bolted into a cup holder because the boat doesn't always move gently. There's a smell down there that anybody who's served will recognize immediately, and nobody who hasn't served could ever imagine. A mix of diesel that isn't really there anymore because we're nuclear, amine, from the CO2 scrubbers, machine oil, and 17 weeks of men who haven't seen the sun. You get used to it. You stop noticing it, the way you stop noticing your own house smells like your own house. That deployment started like most of them started, which is to say, it started with a lie. Although at the time, I didn't know it was a lie. We were told the Corvina was being tasked to support something called a hydrographic and oceanographic survey, working alongside a small detachment from the Naval Oceanographic Office, and that our mission for the first 6 weeks would be relatively benign, mapping seafloor topography and collecting water column data in the vicinity of the Mariana Trench, southwest of Guam. Now, submariners are trained to be suspicious of the word benign, the way sailors on the surface are trained to be suspicious of a red sky at morning. Nobody sends a $360 million fast attack submarine to do a job a civilian survey ship could do for a tenth of the cost, unless the job requires something a survey ship doesn't have. What a survey ship doesn't have is stealth. What a survey ship doesn't have is the ability to sit motionless at 400 feet for 6 hours, listening to something without that something knowing it's being listened to. I want to be honest and tell you that at the time, none of us thought much of it. We assumed we were quietly keeping tabs on Chinese or Russian submarine activity in the area, using the survey mission as cover, which was common enough that it barely qualified as a secret. The Mariana Trench sits close to some of the deepest and most strategically interesting water in the Western Pacific, near Guam, near the old Soviet, now Russian, submarine transit lanes, not far from waters the Chinese Navy was beginning to take a serious interest in even back then. A little quiet listening near the trench made sense to me. It made sense to everybody. That was the beauty of the cover story. It was boring enough and plausible enough that nobody thought to ask a second question. We got underway from Guam on the 11th of June, 1997. I remember the date because it was 2 days before my daughter's 4th birthday, and I'd promised my wife, Diane, that I would call from port before we left, so I could at least hear my daughter's voice sing happy birthday to herself, a couple days early, over a payphone, with a 2-second satellite delay. I did that. I want that on the record, whatever this record turns out to be. Because in a story like this, it's easy to forget that the people it happened to were also just guys trying to be decent fathers between assignments that required them to disappear underwater for months at a time. I hung up that phone, walked back to the boat under a hot Guam sun that I wouldn't feel again for 10 weeks, and climbed down through the forward hatch into the smell of my life's second home. The first 3 weeks were exactly what we'd been told to expect. We ran survey patterns. Our 2 embarked Novociano technicians, civilians both of them, though one had clearly done this kind of embarked work before, and the other clearly hadn't, spent their days hunched over multi-beam sonar displays that were separate from our own combat sonar suite, mapping the trench floor in strips like a lawnmower, cutting a very, very large and very, very deep lawn. My guys and I ran our normal watch rotations on the BQQ-5, doing what we always did, though I'll admit, the trench itself made for interesting listening even without anything unusual happening. The Mariana Trench is the deepest place on the surface of the Earth. Deeper than Everest is tall if you flipped the mountain upside down and dropped it in. And sound behaves strangely in water that deep. The pressure changes the way sound travels through the water column, creates channels and layers that can carry a noise for hundreds of miles, with almost no loss of energy. The same principle the old SOSUS network was built around. A network of seafloor hydrophones the Navy had strung across ocean basins since the 1950s, specifically to exploit that deep sound channel, to listen for Soviet submarines a continent away. I bring this up because it matters to what happened next. The SOSUS network by 1997 had an arrangement of arrays covering huge stretches of the Pacific, and one of those arrays, I would later learn, though not until much later, had been recording something in the vicinity of the Mariana Trench for the better part of 11 months before the Corvina was ever sent out there. Something the analysts back at NAVFAC could not classify. Something they had given a file designation instead of a name, because names imply understanding, and there wasn't any. It was the 4th of July, and I remember that too, obviously, because there is something particularly strange about being deep underwater on your own country's Independence Day, while your own country has no idea where you are or what you're doing, and nobody up there is thinking about you at all. My second-class petty officer on watch that night, a kid from Baton Rouge named Terry Aldos, 23 years old, sharp as anybody I ever trained, had the mid-watch on the BQQ-5. Around 040 ship's time, Aldous called me up from my rack. That in itself wasn't unusual. Sonar techs wake their chief up for all kinds of reasons, most of them turning out to be nothing. A merchant vessel closing faster than expected, a marine mammal contact worth logging, sometimes just a young sailor who wants a second set of ears to confirm he's not hearing things. But Aldis's voice on the phone had a quality to it I want to try to describe accurately, because it's the first thread in everything that came after. He wasn't panicked, he was quiet in a specific way. The way a man gets quiet when he's trying very hard not to sound like he's losing his mind. He said, "Chief, I need you to come listen to something, and I don't want to say what I think it is until you've heard it yourself." I pulled on my coveralls and went down to the shack. Aldis had the contact isolated on one of the passive broadband displays, and he handed me his headset without a word. I want to tell you exactly what I heard, as exactly as memory that's 29 years old and worn smooth by repetition inside my own skull can manage. Because I have turned this sound over in my mind more times than I have turned over anything else that has ever happened to me, including my own wedding, including the birth of my children. It began low, below 100 hertz, a tone that rose in a smooth, almost mathematically clean arc, over about 4 seconds, the way a cello string sounds when a skilled player draws the bow across it with increasing pressure. Except no cello, no whale, nothing biological I had ever cataloged in 16 years of listening to the ocean, produces a tone that clean. Whale calls have texture. They waver. They have harmonics that wander, because they're produced by a living body, muscle and air and tissue, imperfect the way anything alive is imperfect. This tone had none of that. It rose. It held at a frequency around 340 hertz for almost exactly 6 seconds, and then it dropped. Not smoothly this time, but in 5 distinct steps, evenly spaced, like someone descending a staircase in the dark and counting their footsteps out loud. Then silence. 11 seconds of silence. And then it repeated. Exactly. Not similar. Exactly. Down to the timing between each step of the descent, which Aldis had already timed with a stopwatch, because his mind, like mine, had already jumped to the same word neither of us wanted to say out loud in a Navy sonar shack in the middle of the night. Pattern. I logged it as an unidentified biologic, category bio-uncertain, the same designation we'd have used for any whale call we couldn't immediately match to our reference library, because that was the honest, boring, career-safe thing to do, and because some part of me, the part of me that had spent 16 years training myself out of jumping to conclusions, wanted very badly for it to be a whale, a new species, an old species, making a sound nobody had recorded before. I told Aldis, "Good catch, keep tracking it," and I went back to my rack and did not sleep, and lay there in the dark, listening to the hum of the reactor plant through the hull and thinking about staircases. By the following evening, the contact had returned 4 more times, always on the same bearing, always with the same exact repeating structure, rising tone, hold, 5-step descent, 11-second silence, and each time the bearing had shifted very slightly in a way that told us, using basic target motion analysis, that whatever was producing it was moving, slowly, along the trench floor, at a depth our fathometer suggested was somewhere around 36,000 feet, which is to say, near the absolute bottom of the deepest place in the ocean. I brought the recording to my officer in charge of the sonar division, a lieutenant named Paul Ferris, a good officer, sharp, not prone to drama, and I watched his face while he listened to it on my headset, in the shack, with the lights dimmed for the mid-watch. I have seen a lot of faces listening to a lot of sonar contacts over the years. I had never seen a face do what Lieutenant Ferris's face did, which was to go very still, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he does not like the answer to, and then say, without taking off the headset, "Get the captain." The captain's name was Commander Alan Hutchins, and I want to say for the record that I respected him, before all of this, and after all of this, more than almost any officer I ever served under. He came down to the shack in his boxers and a t-shirt because it was 0300 and he'd been asleep, and he listened to the recording twice through without saying a word, and then he asked Lieutenant Ferris and me to step into the wardroom with him, and he closed the door, which on a submarine is a meaningful gesture Because there are almost no doors on a submarine that get closed for privacy. Space doesn't allow for that kind of luxury, and everybody on that boat understood within an hour that something had happened, even the men who never learned what it was. Commander Hutchins asked me 2 questions. He asked me if I was certain the contact wasn't a mechanical artifact, some kind of self-noise from our own boat, a loose fitting, or a resonance in the hull that was bouncing back at us in a way that could fool the array. I told him I'd already run that down with my second class, and we'd ruled it out 3 different ways, cross-referencing against the towed array separately from the hull array, confirming the bearing shift was independent of our own maneuvering, and confirming the frequency signature didn't match anything in our own machinery library. He asked me if I was certain it wasn't a Russian, decoy device, some kind of acoustic deception buoy meant to draw our attention or mask something else. I told him I didn't think so, because a decoy device serves a purpose, and I could not, for the life of me, construct a purpose that made sense of that pattern, that far down, that far from any shipping lane, that far from anywhere a nation-state would have a reason to plant a decoy. Commander Hutchins looked at Lieutenant Ferris, and then he looked at me, and he said something that has stayed with me for 29 years, word for word. He said, "I need you both to understand that I am about to send a message that is going to bring people down here who outrank everybody on this boat, including me, and I need you to be exactly as boring and exactly as professional in front of them as you have been with me. Do not editorialize. Do not speculate. Report only what your instruments tell you." That message went out on an extremely high-frequency burst transmission during our next scheduled communications window, and less than 18 hours later, we received orders that made no sense to anybody who wasn't already read into whatever program this was becoming a part of. We were to proceed to a rendezvous point approximately 40 nautical miles from our current position, where we would conduct what the message vaguely called a personnel and equipment transfer, with a surface vessel, identified only by a hull number I didn't recognize from any Pacific Fleet order of battle I'd memorized, which, as a chief with 16 years in, was a very long list. We surfaced at night, running dark, no navigation lights, and I came up through the bridge hatch on the Fairwater for a breath of air I hadn't smelled in 3 weeks, and saw, maybe a half-mile off, a ship that I initially assumed was some kind of oceanographic research vessel, gray hull, cluttered deck gear, a crane assembly amidships, that I'd later learn was rated for lowering equipment to depths well beyond anything commercially available at the time. What struck me immediately, the way it strikes any career sailor, was what wasn't there. No hull numbers visible anywhere on that ship, no name on the stern that I could make out even through binoculars. A ship with no name is a ship that doesn't officially exist. And I had been in the Navy long enough to know that ships that don't officially exist belong to a very small, very quiet corner of the government, that most sailors go their entire careers without brushing up against even once. 4 men came aboard the Corvina that night by small boat, in the dark, in civilian clothes that had clearly been chosen specifically to look unremarkable and therefore looked more remarkable than a uniform would have. 3 of them were physically unimposing, the kind of men who could disappear in a crowd of accountants, and I would come to understand they were scientists of one discipline or another, though nobody ever gave me their full names or credentials, only first names that I have no reason to believe were real. Dr. Allen, Dr. Witt, a woman, which was itself unusual for 1997 in a program like this, who was introduced to the wardroom simply as Karen, and who I would later realize, based on the way every one of the 3 men deferred to her without exception, was probably the one actually running the science on this operation, regardless of what the paperwork said. The 4th man was different. Older, built like he'd spent a career doing things that required a body that could take punishment, with the specific quiet of a man who has been told many, many times in his life that whatever he's about to see, he is not to react to it. He introduced himself to Commander Hutchins only as Mr. Reyes, no rank given, though everybody in that wardroom understood he had some kind of command authority that superseded, or at least ran parallel to, Hutchins's own, which is an enormously strange thing to watch happen to a submarine captain on his own boat, and I watched Hutchins's jaw work through it with a professionalism I have thought about ever since. They brought equipment aboard that took most of that night to strike below and stow, cases with markings I didn't recognize, and among it, most relevantly to what I did for the Navy, was a self-contained sonar processing rig that Karen and her 2 junior scientists set up in what had been our torpedo room, cannibalizing space from our weapons load to make room for it, which told me, more than anything anybody said out loud, exactly how seriously somebody above Commander Hutchins's pay grade was taking 11 months of unexplained sound patterns from the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Mr. Reyes gathered the ship's officers, myself, Lieutenant Ferris, and, notably, only the crew members who had already had direct exposure to the contact, which by that point was myself, Aldous, and 2 other sonar techs on my watch rotation, in the wardroom the following morning, and he gave us a briefing that I am going to reproduce as accurately as 29 years of memory allows, understanding that I cannot promise you his exact words, only the shape and weight of what he told us, which I have never forgotten. He told us that the acoustic signature we had recorded had first been detected by a fixed seafloor array in October of the previous year, and had recurred, with increasing frequency, over the 11 months since, always within a roughly circular area of the trench floor, about 60 nautical miles across. He told us that a manned submersible operation had been mounted 3 months earlier, using a small deep submergence research vehicle operating from a different surface ship, and that the submersible had descended to a depth of approximately 22,000 feet before its pilot reported. And I am going to use his word here because I have never found a better one, an obstruction on what should have been open seafloor according to every chart the Navy possessed of that section of trench. He told us the submersible's cameras had recorded approximately 40 seconds of footage before the vehicle experienced a sudden, uncommanded loss of all electrical systems, went dark, and had to be recovered on emergency ballast alone, drifting nearly 2 nautical miles off its intended recovery point, during an ascent that took almost 4 hours, with no communication, no lights, and no way for the 2-man crew inside to know if they were going to make it back to the surface at all. He told us that the footage, the 40 seconds of it that existed, had been reviewed by exactly 11 people in the United States government prior to that morning, and that he was choosing, against considerable internal resistance from people whose objections he did not name, to make it 12 of us. And then Karen set up a small monitor on the wardroom table and played us the footage. I am not going to describe to you everything I saw in those 40 seconds, because I have decided, in the process of finally telling this story after 29 years, that there are pieces of it I am still not willing to hand over to strangers on the internet. Not because I signed a paper that told me not to. That paper means nothing to me anymore. But because some things, once said out loud, cannot be unsaid, and I am not convinced the world benefits from every last detail of what a 2-man submersible crew photographed at the bottom of the Mariana Trench in the spring of 1997. What I will tell you is this. The footage showed a structure, not a rock formation, not a geological feature, not a shipwreck, not anything organic that either the 3 scientists in that room, or I, in my own limited expertise, could account for using anything I had ever studied about the ocean floor. It had edges, genuine, straight, geometrically consistent edges, running for a length the submersible's sonar had measured, before the systems failed, at approximately 400 meters, protruding perhaps 30 meters above the surrounding seafloor silt, in water so profoundly, without light, that the only illumination in the frame came from the submersible's own floods, 2 narrow cones of white light sweeping across a surface that did not reflect light the way rock reflects light, or metal reflects light, or anything I have ever seen reflect light. It absorbed it, in a way that made the edges of the structure look less like the edge of an object and more like the edge of a hole cut into the footage itself. The tone, the rising, holding, 5-step descending tone that Aldous had first caught on the 4th of July. It was audible on the submersible's own hydrophone in the final 8 seconds of the footage, and it was, according to Karen, louder and closer than anything the fixed seafloor array had ever recorded, loud enough that the 2 pilots reported feeling it, not hearing it, in their chest cavities through the hull of the submersible, in the seconds immediately before every system on that vehicle went dark at once. I looked around that wardroom table when the footage ended. Lieutenant Ferris was staring at a point on the table that wasn't there. Aldous had gone the color of the inside of a shell, And I remember thinking, distinctly, 23 years old, this is too much for 23. And then thinking, immediately after, it is too much for 42 too, Michael. Don't kid yourself. Commander Hutchins's face had returned to the same professional stillness I'd seen the night he'd asked me 2 questions in his boxer shorts, but his hands, resting on the wardroom table, were not entirely steady, and I noticed it because in 16 years I had never once seen Alan Hutchins's hands do anything but exactly what he told them to do. Mr. Reyes let the silence sit for a good 10 seconds before he spoke again, and what he said next is the sentence that changed the entire remaining course of my Navy career, my marriage, and, though I didn't know it yet, my relationship with everything I had previously understood to be true about the nature of the world I was living in. He said, "The Corvina has been selected for a follow-up operation because she is quieter than the vessel that supported the submersible dive, and because her sonar division, meaning my division, meaning me, has demonstrated the acoustic sensitivity necessary to track the contact passively without alerting whatever is producing it to our presence." He said the objective of this operation was not visual reconnaissance. It was communication. Communication. I remember Lieutenant Ferris repeating the word back, not quite as a question, more like a man tasting a food he suspects is spoiled before he commits to swallowing it. Communication with what? He asked, and Mr. Reyes, to his credit, did not dodge the question the way I expected a man in his position to dodge it. He said, "We don't know." And that is the honest and complete answer. And it is the answer you are all going to have to be comfortable operating alongside for the remainder of this patrol. He said the working theory among the small circle of scientists who had been briefed on the acoustic data was that the pattern, the rising tone, the 6-second hold, the 5-step descent, was not a mating call or a territorial signal or anything else in the standard taxonomy of things large animals do underwater to communicate with other members of their own species. It was structured the way a greeting is structured. It repeated the way a hail repeats, when the party sending it has no way of knowing whether it's being received and is simply going to keep sending it, on a loop, indefinitely, until something answers back, or until whoever is sending it decides nobody is listening. Karen put it more bluntly than Mr. Reyes did, later, in a private conversation I had with her in the torpedo room a few days into the operation, and I'm going to trust my memory of her exact phrasing here, because it's one of those sentences that lodges itself permanently. She said, "Chief, in 11 months, it has never once stopped. It goes silent for hours, sometimes a full day, but it always starts again, exactly the same, down to the millisecond. And either that is the most disciplined biological organism in the history of this planet, or it isn't biological at all, or it isn't trying to talk to another one of itself. It's trying to talk to us, and it has been trying for 11 months, and nobody has answered it back." That last idea sat in my chest like a swallowed stone for the rest of that deployment, and if I am honest with you, it has never fully left. The idea that something at the bottom of the ocean had been calling out, patiently, precisely, for the better part of a year, into a silence that we, the country with the largest and most sophisticated underwater listening network on the planet, had simply refused to break, not because we couldn't hear it, we could hear it perfectly well, but because nobody in a position of authority had been willing to authorize a response until they understood what they were responding to. And now, apparently, somebody had decided that understanding could wait, and the response could not. The plan, as it was explained to us over the following 2 days while the Corvina crept slowly back toward the trench, at a depth and speed calculated to keep us as acoustically invisible as possible, involved the equipment in the torpedo room, which turned out to include not just passive listening gear, but a specially built acoustic transducer, a device capable of generating a very precise, very controlled sound underwater, powerful enough to be heard clearly at extreme range and depth. Karen and her team had, over the preceding 11 months, based on analysis of the recorded pattern that I did not have clearance to see the full details of, constructed a response signal, not a copy of the original pattern, a reply to it. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it in 1997. A group of oceanographers and signals analysts, none of whom would tell me their actual specialties, had spent almost a year trying to compose the first sentence of a conversation with something none of us could describe, using nothing but the shape of its own voice as a guide, the way you might try to guess a foreign language's grammar, purely from listening to a stranger recite the same 12 words over and over on a street corner, never responding to anyone, never varying, until you finally worked up the nerve to try saying something back. We reached the operational area on the 9th of July. Command of the actual listening watch during the operation was, formally, still mine, which is a detail I want to be honest about because I think it matters to how much responsibility I carry for what happened, and I have carried it, in one form or another, for 29 years. Karen's team would generate and transmit the response signal through the torpedo room transducer on Mr. Reyes's authorization, and my division on the BQQ-5 would monitor for any change in the contact's behavior. Commander Hutchins made the decision, and I remember him making it explicitly and out loud in front of the wardroom, that the Corvina herself would remain at a stationary hover, silent running, roughly 11 nautical miles from the estimated position of the structure, using the towed array at maximum extension to monitor from the greatest survivable distance, while the transducer itself, lowered on a thin, high-tensile cable to a depth of about 8,000 feet, well above the trench floor, would do the actual talking. Nobody said the word safety margin out loud in that wardroom, but everybody in it understood that 11 miles and 8,000 feet of vertical separation was exactly that, a margin, chosen by people who had absolutely no data to tell them whether it was anywhere close to sufficient, because there had never before been a data point for what an appropriate safety margin looked like when the thing on the other end of a hydrophone might not be a submarine, or a whale, or anything with a name. Aldous asked to be on watch for it. I want to include that detail because I think about it more than almost anything else in this story, more even than what I eventually saw with my own eyes. He was 23 years old. He'd been the one to first catch the pattern on the 4th of July, and something in him, some mixture of pride and dread and a young man's need to see a thing through to its end once he started it, made him come find me in the mess the night before the transmission and ask me, quietly, "Chief, put me on watch for it. I want to be there." I said yes. I have asked myself many times over the intervening years whether I would say yes again, knowing what I know now, and I honestly don't know the answer, which is its own kind of answer. At 0300 on the 10th of July, Karen's team transmitted the response signal. I was in the sonar shack with Aldous and one other tech, headphones on, the BQQ-5 waterfall display glowing its usual sickly green in the red-lit dark of the shack, and I heard, faintly, through the hull, the transducer's own transmission as a brief, structured pulse of sound, 3 notes, rising, that even I, with no training in whatever science had constructed it, could tell had been built to echo the shape, the rhythm, the grammar, if that's the right word, of what we'd been hearing for 11 months. And then we waited. Nothing happened for 6 minutes. I want to stress how long 6 minutes is, in a silent room where 17 men are holding their breath, some of them literally, because I watched more than one sailor forget to breathe normally during that watch. And then, at 0309, the contact returned, on the same bearing it had always returned on, and Aldous, headphones pressed so hard against his own skull his knuckles had gone white on the cups, said, "Chief, it changed." The rising tone was the same. The 6-second hold was the same. But the 5-step descent, the same 5 steps, exact, down to the millisecond, every single time for 11 months, came down in 4 steps instead of 5, and ended not in silence but in a new tone, a single sustained note, higher than anything in the original pattern, that held for almost 30 full seconds before it finally faded. Karen's people, monitoring on their own gear in the torpedo room, apparently caught the same anomaly at the same instant, because within 90 seconds Mr. Reyes was standing in the door of my sonar shack, which he had not done before that moment, asking me directly, "Chief, in your professional opinion, is that a response or is that a coincidence?" I told him the truth, which is the only thing I have ever known how to offer anybody in a shack like that. I told him that in 16 years of listening to the ocean, I had never heard a biological organism alter a call it had repeated, without variation for 11 straight months within 9 minutes of a stimulus specifically constructed to resemble that call, and that if he was asking me to bet my career on whether that was coincidence, I would bet my career, right there in front of him, that it was not. Over the following 4 days, the exchange continued, and I use the word exchange deliberately now, because by the 3rd transmission there was no scientist on that boat, however cautious, however trained to speak only in careful, hedged, peer-reviewable language, who was still willing to call it anything else in private. Each time Karen's team sent the constructed reply signal, the contact answered within minutes, and each time, the pattern shifted, in small, deliberate-seeming ways, always keeping the core shape, the rising tone, the hold, but varying the descent, adding tones, occasionally producing something that Karen, in a rare, unguarded moment over coffee in the wardroom at an hour when most of the boat was asleep, described to me as sounding almost like it was asking a question back. I asked her what a question sounds like to something with no mouth, no vocal cords, no biology we could identify at all, and she looked at me for a long moment before she answered, and what she said has stayed with me every single day since. She said, "Chief, a question sounds like a rising tone that stops. Everything else, the holds, the steps down, those feel like statements, declarations, something being told to us. But twice now, on the 2nd and the 4th exchange, the pattern has ended on a rise, unresolved, hanging in the air, or in the water, however you want to think about it. And both times, every single scientist listening to it, in that torpedo room, felt the same thing, at the exact same moment, which was the specific, bodily certainty that it was waiting for us to say something back, and we had absolutely nothing more sophisticated to send it than the same 3 or 4 constructed phrases we'd started with. I want to introduce you to another man now, because his part in this matters more than I understood at the time. His name was Senior Chief Walter Ingram, and he was not a sonar tech. He ran the engineering department, but he had also, for reasons that had nothing to do with the Navy, been a lay minister at a small Baptist church in Norfolk for almost 20 years, and everybody on that boat, officers included, treated Walt Ingram's opinion on matters outside his professional expertise with a respect that had nothing to do with rank. Walt did not have clearance for any of what was happening in that torpedo room, technically, but on a boat that small, in an operation that strange, information moves through the crew whether or not anybody with a clipboard has approved its movement, and by the 5th day, most of the senior enlisted men aboard the Corvina had some working understanding of what we were doing out there, even if they'd never heard the recording themselves. Walt found me alone in the crew's mess on the 6th night, both of us unable to sleep for reasons that had stopped needing explanation between men who'd served together as long as we had, and he asked me, without any preamble, whether I thought what we were talking to down there was something God had made. I told him I honestly didn't know, and he nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. And then he said something I have turned over in my mind more than almost anything else Mr. Reyes or Karen or anybody with an actual scientific credential said to me during that entire operation. He said, "Michael, there's a verse in Psalms, 104th chapter. It says, 'There go the ships, and there is that Leviathan whom thou hast made to play therein.' I always read that as poetry, something a shepherd wrote about the sea being big and strange and full of things bigger than him. But I got to thinking, sitting in my rack tonight, what if it wasn't poetry? What if somebody, a long time ago, actually saw something down in that water, something with no business making sense to a Bronze Age mind, and the only word he had for it was Leviathan, and the only thing he could think to do with it was put it in a psalm and hand it down to us so that 30 centuries later, some sailor in a submarine off Guam would at least have a word for what he was looking at, even if the word didn't explain a single thing." I didn't have an answer for Walt that night. I still don't, 29 years later, lying in a hospital bed with a body that's quitting on me. But I think about that psalm more than I think about almost any other 12 verses in that whole book, and I think Walt Ingram understood something about what we were doing down there that none of the men with doctorates in that torpedo room understood, which is that some encounters are not primarily scientific, whatever the equipment involved might suggest, and a man ignores that dimension of the experience at the cost of missing the actual point of it. On the 7th day, the operation changed character, and this is the part of the story I have to tell you carefully. because it's the part where a young man I was responsible for got hurt, and I have spent 29 years deciding how much of that responsibility belongs to me. Mr. Reyes, on instructions relayed from somewhere well above his own authority, authorized what Karen's team called a proximity approach. Rather than continuing to transmit the response signal from a stationary position 8,000 feet down and 11 miles off, the transducer rig would be lowered further, to approximately 18,000 feet, and the Corvina herself would close the range to just under 4 nautical miles in order to gather higher fidelity acoustic data on the response, using both the towed array and, for the first time, a small remotely operated vehicle we had aboard, launched from a specialized hatch that had been fitted to the boat during a maintenance period I now understood had never been an ordinary maintenance period at all. Commander Hutchins objected. I was not in the room for that particular conversation, but Lieutenant Ferris told me about it afterward, and I believe him, because Ferris was not a man who exaggerated, and what he told me was that Hutchins argued, forcefully, that closing to 4 miles violated every principle of acoustic stealth the boat had been designed around, that we would be transmitting our own presence more clearly than we ever had, and that nobody, not Reyes, not Karen, not whoever was giving Reyes his own orders from Washington or wherever this chain of command actually terminated, could tell him with any confidence what the contact's reaction to a closer approach would be, given that its entire behavioral profile prior to 11 days ago had consisted of a single, unchanging call played into an empty ocean. Reyes's response, according to Ferris, was that the decision had already been made above both their heads, and that Commander Hutchins retained full authority to abort the operation and surface the boat if he judged, in his professional opinion as commanding officer, that the safety of his crew was being compromised, but that the decision to close the range itself was not his to make. I want you to notice, because I noticed it very clearly at the time, that this is the exact structure of authority that allows terrible decisions to get made by nobody in particular. Reyes could say it wasn't his call. Whoever gave Reyes his orders could say, if this ever became a Senate hearing, that the man on the scene, Commander Hutchins, retained ultimate authority and chose to proceed. And Hutchins, God help him, chose to proceed, because the alternative was aborting a mission of unknown but clearly enormous strategic importance based on a feeling, and Alan Hutchins was not a man who aborted missions based on feelings, even when, I believe, every feeling he had was telling him exactly what was about to happen. We closed to 4 nautical miles over the course of 6 hours, moving as quietly as a boat that size can move, which is to say, quietly enough that I still believe, to this day, whatever was down there did not detect our approach acoustically. What it detected, I have come to believe, it detected some other way entirely, and that belief is the single most difficult thing about this story for me to say out loud, because I have no instrument, no data, nothing but my own memory of what happened in that sonar shack on the night of the 17th of July, 1997, to offer you as evidence. The ROV went into the water a little after 2200. It was a small vehicle, tethered by a thin fiber optic cable, carrying a low-light camera, its own set of hydrophones, and 2 small floodlights, piloted by one of the civilian technicians, a soft-spoken man everybody called Griff, from a control station set up in the same torpedo room that had become the operational heart of the entire deployment. I was in the sonar shack with Aldous and a third tech named Delgado, monitoring the towed array, while Ferris and Commander Hutchins split their time between the control room and the torpedo room, and Mr. Reyes stood, for most of that night, in the passageway between the 2 spaces, present in both places at once, the way certain men manage to be during a crisis, by simply refusing to sit down anywhere. The ROV descended for almost 90 minutes before Griff's voice came over the boat's internal comms, flat, professional, the voice of a man trained not to editorialize, saying only, structure in view, range approximately 200 meters, holding position. I left the sonar shack, against regulation, leaving Delgado on watch, and went to the torpedo room, because I could not make myself stay in that shack, listening to second-hand descriptions of something I had spent 11 days building a professional relationship with, entirely through my ears, and I wanted, for reasons I still cannot fully explain to you, to see it. What I saw on that monitor, in the 90 seconds before everything went wrong, is the single hardest thing I have ever had to describe honestly. Because my instinct, even now, 29 years later, sitting with a laptop in a hospital room typing this out sentence by sentence, is to reach for comparisons, and every comparison betrays what I actually saw by making it smaller and more familiar than it was. It was not a submarine. It was not a whale or a squid or any deep-sea creature that biology has ever catalogued, though something about its proportions, when Griff's floodlights caught the edge of it moving at the boundary of the light, made me think, involuntarily, of the way an eel moves, a long, deliberate undulation with no wasted motion. Except this movement was happening along something the sonar had already told us was at minimum 300 meters in length, and nothing that moves like a living thing should be that large, not on this planet, not in any ocean I had ever studied the biology of during 16 years of a career built entirely around understanding what lives in salt water. Karen, standing beside me, made a sound I will never forget, a single, short exhale, not quite a word, and beside her, one of the other scientists, Dr. Witt, said, very quietly, "Oh my God," in a voice that had nothing performative in it at all, the voice of a man whose entire framework for understanding his own field of study had just been quietly and permanently rearranged. And then the tone started again, the rising tone, except this time it wasn't coming through a hydrophone processed and cleaned and displayed on a waterfall screen. It was coming through the ROV's own onboard microphone, live, close enough that the audio distorted, close enough that everybody standing in that torpedo room felt it. The way Karen had told me weeks earlier, the submersible pilots felt it in their chest cavities. And I want to tell you honestly that I felt it too, a vibration low in my sternum that had nothing to do with the boat's own machinery. And every man in that compartment went still at the exact same instant. The particular stillness of animals, because that is what we are, underneath the ranks and the training, when something reminds our bodies, more directly and more honestly than our minds are usually permitted to be reminded, that we are very small and very far from anywhere that would help us. The tone held. It did not descend. It held at that single sustained high note, the one Aldous had first flagged as new 11 days earlier, and it held for far longer than 30 seconds this time. And as it held, the ROV's camera feed began to distort, not go dark exactly, but degrade, streaking, the image tearing itself into horizontal bands of static that pulsed in time. I would swear to this on anything you want me to swear on, in time with the tone itself. And Griff's voice came over the comm, no longer flat, no longer trained, just a young man's voice climbing rapidly toward panic, saying, "I'm losing telemetry. I'm losing. I don't have control inputs. She's not responding to the stick." And then the feed went black, and the tone, in the same instant, simply stopped, not faded, stopped, the way a recording stops when somebody pulls the plug, and the silence that followed was worse than any sound I have heard before or since. Here is where I have to tell you about Terry Aldous, and I have put off telling you this part for as long as I reasonably can within an honest accounting of that night, because it is the part of this story that I still, after 29 years, have not made complete peace with. Aldous was in the sonar shack when the tone hit the towed array at full strength, several seconds before it reached the ROV's local microphone, because sound travels faster through water than the fiber optic telemetry link was relaying processed audio, a detail that would only be reconstructed afterward, during a technical review I was permitted to sit in on, because I was the one who found him. Delgado told me, in a statement he gave that same night, and that I believe completely, that Aldous, on hearing the tone come through his own headset, at a volume and clarity beyond anything we'd previously recorded, simply stood up from his console, without a word, pulled the headset off, and said, quietly, "Chief needs to hear this," and walked out of the shack toward the torpedo room, exactly as I was walking back the other way. We must have passed within 20 feet of each other in a passageway that narrow, and I did not see him, because I was focused entirely on getting back to my own post, and that is a detail I have never told anyone else in 29 years, that I walked past Terry Aldous in a submarine's passageway on the worst night of both our lives and never even looked up. Delgado found him 4 minutes later, in the passageway outside the torpedo room, on the deck, unresponsive but breathing, and the boat's independent duty corpsman, a good, steady man named Petty Officer Reyes, no relation to the other Reyes, was working on him within 90 seconds. Aldous regained consciousness about 11 minutes after that, disoriented, unable at first to say his own name correctly, complaining of a ringing in his ears that the corpsman logged as acute acoustic trauma, consistent with overpressure exposure, though I want to be honest that nobody on that boat, including the corpsman, fully believed that diagnosis explained everything we were seeing, because Aldous's right eye, for close to 6 hours afterward, would not track properly with his left, drifting independently in a way that made 3 separate people who looked at him that night visibly recoil before they caught themselves. He recovered. I want to say that clearly and immediately, so you're not carrying dread through the rest of this sentence, the way I carried it through the rest of that night. Terry Aldous is alive today, as far as I know, living somewhere outside Baton Rouge, and the eye came back to normal function within about 8 months, according to the one letter I received from him almost 2 years after we'd both left the Navy. A letter that said almost nothing about what happened, and everything about how much he needed to say almost nothing about what happened, which I understood completely, because I was living the exact same silence myself. Commander Hutchins made the decision to abort within about 90 seconds of the tone cutting out, and I want to state clearly that nobody in that torpedo room, not Reyes, not Karen, not Dr. Witt, said a single word to challenge him, which told me everything I needed to know about how frightened the civilians on that boat had become in the space of about 4 minutes. Hutchins ordered the ROV recovered, what was left of it anyway, since telemetry never re-established, and Griff eventually had to haul the tether in blind, hand over hand, with 2 other crewmen helping, not knowing until the vehicle actually broke the surface of the recovery bay whether there would be anything on the end of the cable at all. There was. The ROV came back mostly intact, physically, though every electronic system aboard it was completely dead, fried in a way that the technical review weeks later, at a facility I was flown to under conditions I'll describe in a moment, could not fully explain using any conventional electromagnetic pulse model they tried to fit to the damage pattern. The camera housing, when they finally cracked it open, held a data cassette that had somehow survived, and that cassette contained the last 11 seconds of usable video before the feed degraded into static, 11 seconds that I was shown exactly once, in a windowless room in Maryland, 6 weeks later, and that I have never spoken about to another living soul until this recording, and that I am still, even now, not going to describe to you in full, because there is a version of this story where I tell you every detail I remember, and you feel, for a few minutes, the particular kind of fear I have carried every day since 1997, and I have decided, weighing that against what good it actually does you to carry it too, that I would rather you not. I will tell you one thing from those 11 seconds, because I think it's the detail that matters most, more than the shape of the thing, or its size, or anything else my mind still occasionally serves back to me in dreams I no longer discuss with my second wife, who has been patient with a husband who wakes up some nights making a sound she describes as closer to a held breath finally released than a scream. In the last 2 seconds of usable footage, before the static took over entirely, the creature, and I am going to use that word now, because after 29 years, I no longer have the energy to keep hedging around it, with words like structure, or contact, or entity. The creature turned, not away from the ROV's lights, which is what every instinct built by a lifetime of nature documentaries told me a deep-sea animal startled by light should do, toward them, and in the half-second before the feed died completely, there was, along what I can only describe as the leading edge of its structure, an arrangement, I want to be careful here, an arrangement of shapes, symmetrical, evenly spaced, that Karen, in that Maryland briefing room 6 weeks later, pointed to on a single freeze-framed still, and said, very carefully, very clinically, in a voice I could tell was costing her a great deal of composure to maintain, "We believe these may be sensory organs." And I asked her, "Sensory organs for what?" And she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Chief, we genuinely don't know. but based on their arrangement and the way they were oriented in that final frame, our best working hypothesis is that they were oriented toward the camera, toward us, not toward the light, toward the lens. As though whatever it was, wherever it kept whatever passes for its awareness, had understood, in the final half-second before some mechanism we still cannot explain, ended the transmission, that it was being watched, and had chosen, in that half-second, to look back. The Corvina surfaced 90 minutes later under emergency conditions, transmitted a compressed status report, and rendezvoused with the same nameless surface ship 2 days after that. Mr. Reyes and his team, along with the ROV, the torpedo room equipment, and every scrap of recorded data from the operation, transferred off the boat, and I remember standing on the deck watching them go, and Karen, of all of them, was the one who stopped, briefly, in front of me, and said, quietly enough that only I could hear it, "Chief, thank you for your ears." And then she was gone down the ladder into the small boat, and I never saw her again. And I have thought about that sentence, "Thank you for your ears," more times in 29 years than almost any other sentence anybody has ever said to me, including things my own wife said to me on our wedding day, because it was the only moment in that entire operation when somebody with more knowledge than me about what we'd encountered acknowledged, out loud, that what I'd contributed, the specific, trained capacity to hear the difference between a whale and something that was very deliberately not a whale, had mattered. 6 weeks later, I was flown, alone, without explanation given to my own chain of command, beyond a note that read, "Temporary additional duty," to a facility outside Washington that I will not further identify, where I was shown the footage I've described, debriefed for 11 hours across 2 days by people who never gave me their real names, and asked to sign a document that I read 3 times before I signed it, because I wanted to be completely certain I understood what it was asking of me. It did not use the words classified information in the way I'd signed for classified information a dozen times before in my career, acknowledging that I understood the penalties for unauthorized disclosure under existing statute. This document was different. It stated, in language I remember more precisely than I remember almost any other document I've ever signed, that I acknowledged the events described in Operation Deep Listen, referenced only by that designation, and never explained further in the document itself, involved matters of national security whose disclosure, in the government's assessment, could reasonably be expected to cause exceptionally grave damage, and that I understood I was agreeing to a lifetime, not a term-limited, but a lifetime, non-disclosure obligation, a phrase I had never encountered before, and have rarely encountered since, and one of the men in that room, not unkindly, almost gently, told me that this obligation would survive my discharge from the Navy, my death, and, he said, and I want to be precise, because this detail has haunted me specifically, would be treated by the government as surviving any statement I might make under psychiatric care, religious confession, or, and this is the phrase that has never left me, any deathbed disclosure. I sat with that phrase for a long time before I signed, deathbed disclosure, as though somebody in that room, in 1997, had already anticipated that a man might carry a secret like this all the way to the actual edge of his own life, and still feel compelled, at the very end, to set it down, and had drafted language specifically to try to reach past that edge and silence him anyway. I am, as I record this, 48 days past a diagnosis that gives me, generously, a handful of months, and I want whoever eventually reviews whatever comes of this recording to know that I read that document again, 3 weeks ago, from a manila envelope I kept in a safety deposit box in Dayton, Ohio for 29 years, and I have decided that a government which believed in 1997 that its authority to silence a man extended past his own death does not, in my final accounting of the matter, retain a legitimate claim on my last few months of consciousness. I finished that deployment and 6 more after it, because I did not know, in 1997, what else a 35-year-old sonar technician with a wife and a young daughter was supposed to do with his life, besides keep doing the only thing he'd ever trained to do well, and because the Navy, to its credit or its shame, I've never fully decided which, simply absorbed what had happened to the Corvina's crew back into the ordinary rhythm of service without ever acknowledging it had happened at all. There was no counseling offered that mentioned the actual event. There was no formal recognition, no commendation, nothing on any of our records that would tell a future historian anything unusual had occurred aboard SSN 798 in July of 1997. Commander Hutchins was promoted to captain 18 months later and given command of a squadron, and I saw him exactly twice more in my career, both times at official functions where we shook hands and said almost nothing to each other beyond the pleasantries rank requires. And both times I watched something pass behind his eyes when our hands met that told me he was carrying it exactly the way I was, silently, permanently, alone even in the presence of the one other man who knew precisely what he was carrying. I want to tell you honestly about what the years afterward did to me, because I think it matters more to this story than the creature itself does. Strange as that is to say. My first marriage, to a woman named Diane who I loved very much, and who deserved a husband more present than I was capable of being after 1997, ended in 2002, not dramatically, not with any single fight either of us could point to afterward as the cause, but slowly, the way a hull corrodes from the inside, where nobody can see it happening until the day it simply gives way. I started drinking more than I should have, not the kind of drinking that gets a man in trouble at work. I was always too disciplined for that, too much chief in my bones, even off duty. But the kind of drinking that a man does alone, in a garage, at 10 o'clock at night, specifically so that his body will finally stop replaying a sound that his conscious mind has otherwise gotten fairly skilled at not thinking about during daylight hours. Diane asked me once, during the last year of our marriage, sitting across from me at our kitchen table in Groton, what happened out there, because she knew, the way any wife of 20 years married to a submariner knows, that something specific had happened, not just the ordinary accumulated weight of a hard career. And I told her I couldn't tell her, and she said, "Michael, I'm not asking you to break your oath. I'm asking you to let me carry some of whatever this is with you." And I still, to this day, 24 years later, believe that was the moment I lost her. Not because she stopped loving me, but because I looked at the woman I'd built a family with, and decided that a piece of paper signed in a windowless room in Maryland mattered more than letting her share a burden that was slowly killing both of us. And I chose the paper, and I have never fully forgiven myself for that choice. And it is, if I'm honest with you, part of why I am making this recording now. Because I would rather my children, and whoever else this eventually reaches, understand the actual shape of what their father carried, than continue to let a government's outdated fear of embarrassment define the last true thing I ever tell anyone. I remarried in 2006 to a woman named Carol who I have been with for 20 years now, and who has been, without question, the steadiest and kindest presence of my adult life. And I told her, early, within our first year together, before I asked her to marry me, that I carried something from my time in the Navy I couldn't discuss, and that it would occasionally surface in ways she might find strange, nightmares, certain sounds that would make me go quiet and leave a room, an aversion to swimming in open water that developed sometime around 1998, and never once, in all the years since, loosened its grip on me. She never pushed. She has never once, in 20 years, asked me to explain. And I think that patience, that willingness to love a man around a locked room in his own chest without demanding the key, is the single greatest gift anyone has given me in my entire life. And it is also, strangely, part of what has made this decision to finally speak so difficult, because I know that once I say this out loud, that locked room becomes visible to her too, and I don't know yet how she'll feel carrying it, though I trust her enough to believe she'll carry it the way she's carried everything else. I tried, over the years, quietly, carefully, never in a way that would have triggered any obvious red flag, to learn what had happened to the others. Aldis's letter, the one I mentioned, arrived in 1999, and I wrote back once, and we exchanged 3 or 4 more letters over the following 2 years, before they simply stopped. The way correspondence between men who share something they can't discuss tends to stop, not from anger, just from the exhaustion of trying to maintain a friendship built around an enormous silence. I tried to find Karen exactly once, in 2011, using nothing more sophisticated than an internet search of a first name and a rough professional description, which is a hopeless enough approach that I think some part of me chose it specifically because I knew it would fail and I wouldn't have to find out anything that might frighten me further. I found nothing, which either means she used a false name in 1997, which I now consider likely, or that she has spent the last 3 decades as carefully unfindable as the ship that brought her aboard the Corvina in the first place. I did find one thing, in 2019, that I want to include here, because I think it's the closest I ever came to corroboration of any kind, beyond my own memory, and whatever remains, if anything remains, in a classified archive I will never be permitted to access. A retired oceanographer, publishing under his own name in a small academic newsletter I stumbled across by accident, while researching something else entirely for my daughter's school project, made an offhand reference, in an article ostensibly about historical SOSUS array deployments, to what he called an unresolved acoustic anomaly detected in the Mariana Trench region between 1996 and 1998, describing it, in exactly these words, which I copied into a notebook I still have, as, quote, a recurring low-frequency signal of undetermined biological or non-biological origin that ceased entirely and permanently in the autumn of 1997 and has not recurred in the network's records in the 22 years since. I read that sentence more times than I can count. Ceased entirely and permanently in the autumn of 1997. 2 months after the Corvina's operation. Whatever we spoke to, whatever we frightened, whatever we may have hurt with that transducer and that ROV, and 11 days of a species trying, badly, clumsily, dangerously, to say hello to something that had apparently been trying to say hello to us for the better part of a year, before we finally worked up the courage to answer. It stopped calling after we answered it. And I have never been able to decide, in the 7 years since I read that sentence, whether that means we successfully completed a conversation, said whatever needed saying, and let it go quiet the way a conversation naturally winds down, or whether it means something else entirely, something closer to what Walt Ingram was reaching for, with his psalm about the Leviathan, that we frightened something ancient and vast and patient, badly enough that it simply decided, after 11 months of trying, that we were not worth continuing to speak to at all, and retreated back into whatever depth of silence it had come from before 1996, disappointed in us in a way I don't have any framework, scientific or theological, sufficient to fully understand. There is one more encounter I have to tell you about before I bring this to its end, because it happened only 4 years ago, in 2022, and because it changed the way I understood everything that came before it. I was at a change of command ceremony in Norfolk, attending as a retired guest because a young officer I'd mentored years earlier was taking command of his own submarine, and across the reception hall, older now, heavier, moving with a cane he hadn't needed the last time I'd seen him, was Alan Hutchins. We found each other the way men who've shared something like what we'd shared always seem to find each other in a crowded room, some instinct neither of us could have explained, and we stood together near a window overlooking the pier for the better part of 20 minutes, saying almost nothing about anything that mattered. The weather, grandchildren, the state of the surface fleet, until, right before he had to leave, he put his hand on my shoulder, the way a commanding officer does when he's about to say something that isn't really an order, and he said, "Michael, I think about it every year on the 17th of July, every single year, for 25 years. And I told him I did too, and he nodded, and he said one more thing before he walked away, and I have not been able to stop turning it over since. He said, "I've come to believe we weren't the first ones they tried to talk to. I think they'd been trying a long time before us, in a lot of oceans, to a lot of frightened sailors who never had the equipment to understand what they were hearing, and I think we were just the first ones with good enough ears to finally notice." And then he walked away, leaning on that cane, back into the crowd, and I never saw him again, and I read, 11 months later, a small obituary in a Norfolk paper that a friend forwarded to me, that Captain Alan Hutchins, United States Navy, retired, had passed away peacefully at home, survived by his wife of 41 years and 3 children, and the obituary said nothing, of course, about the Mariana Trench, or the Corvina, or a torpedo room converted into an acoustics lab, or a tone that held for 30 seconds and made 17 men feel it in their chests, because that is not the kind of thing an obituary is permitted to say, and I understood, reading it, that unless I did something about it myself, that silence was simply going to keep compounding, generation after generation, sailor after sailor, until every single man who had been in that torpedo room on the 17th of July, 1997, was dead, and the entire event would exist nowhere at all except in a classified file that some future archivist, decades from now, might or might not ever be authorized to declassify, by which point it would be nothing but a name and a date to them, Deep Listen, 1997, with no human face attached to it at all. I was diagnosed in March of this year. I want to tell you plainly what that process looked like, not because it's the point of this recording, but because I think you deserve to know exactly what kind of man is telling you this story, and what condition he's in while he tells it. It started with back pain. I assumed, at 64, was simply the accumulated cost of a body that had spent 22 years climbing ladders and standing watches on steel decks. It was not back pain. A scan in February found a mass on my pancreas that had already, by the time anybody found it, done the quiet, patient work that pancreatic cancer is infamous for doing, spreading to my liver before I'd had a single symptom that would have prompted anybody to look for it sooner. The oncologist, a kind woman about my daughter's age, sat with Carol and me in a small office with a box of tissues on the desk that I found myself staring at for most of the conversation, and explained, gently, that we were talking about months, not years, and that the specific number depended heavily on how my body responded to treatment, which I elected to pursue. Not because I believed it would save me, I have never once believed that, but because Carol asked me to, and because Walt Ingram, God rest him, he passed in 2015, always used to say that a man owes his family whatever extra time he can honestly buy them, even time he knows in advance is going to end the same way regardless. I started thinking about this recording the same week as that diagnosis, and I want to be honest that it took me 4 months to actually sit down and make it, because every time I opened my laptop to begin, that phrase came back to me, survive any deathbed disclosure. And some old, deeply trained part of me, the part that spent 22 years internalizing the idea that my government's judgment about what I was and wasn't permitted to say mattered more than my own conscience, hesitated, every single time, for weeks at a stretch. What finally moved me past that hesitation was not courage exactly, though I hope some of what I'm doing here counts as a form of it. It was my granddaughter, my daughter's oldest, 12 years old now, the same daughter whose 4th birthday I called home for from a payphone in Guam the day before this all began. She was doing a school project on the ocean, on the Mariana Trench specifically, as it happened, entirely by coincidence, and she asked me, sitting at my kitchen table with a poster board and a set of markers, "Grandpa, you were in the Navy, did you ever go down there?" And I looked at this child, who has no idea what her grandfather actually did in the summer of 1997, and who was drawing, with a purple marker, a cartoon anglerfish at the bottom of a construction paper ocean, and I understood, with a clarity I had not previously managed in 29 years of carrying this alone, that I did not want to die and leave that same silence sitting on top of her someday, the way it had sat on top of me, the way it had apparently sat on top of Alan Hutchins for 25 years, until a cane and a change of command ceremony finally gave him one conversation, 20 minutes, near a window, to set a small piece of it down before he ran out of time entirely. I am not going to tell you everything. I want to be honest about that, one final time, before I close this out. There are technical details about the transducer, about the exact frequency and construction of the response signal Karen's team built, about the facility outside Washington where I was debriefed, about certain things in those final 11 seconds of footage that I have decided, even now, freed as I am from any obligation I once felt bound by, are not mine alone to release into the world, because other men were in that room with me, some of them, as far as I know, still alive, still bound by the same paper I've decided to set down, and I do not have the right to make that decision for them, just because I've made it for myself. What I have told you is true, As true as 29 years of memory and a dying man's diminishing patience for anything but honesty can make it. A structure exists, or existed, or exists still for all I know, at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, at a depth of approximately 36,000 feet, in the darkest, most crushing environment on the surface of this planet. And in the summer of 1997, it was trying, patiently, precisely, for the better part of a year, to get the attention of anyone at all on the surface of an ocean it had apparently been listening to for far longer than any of us have listening equipment sophisticated enough to have noticed. We answered it. Badly, clumsily, dangerously, with instruments built by people guessing at a grammar they didn't understand, guided by scientists who never told me their real names, aboard a submarine whose own captain spent the last 25 years of his life carrying the weight of a decision he was never fully permitted to make on his own. And 2 months after we answered, it stopped calling. And as far as I know, as far as that oceanographer's newsletter from 2019 was able to tell me, it has not called again in the 29 years since. I think about Walt Ingram's psalm more now than I ever did in 1997, lying in a hospital bed with a body that no longer does what I ask of it, in the particular quiet hours between 3 and 5 in the morning, that anybody who has ever been seriously ill will recognize as the hours when a man's thoughts stop being polite to him. There go the ships, and there is that Leviathan, whom thou hast made to play therein. I used to think, when Walt first said it to me in that crew's mess in July of 1997, that he was reaching for comfort in an old book, because the situation had outstripped every modern framework either of us had available to make sense of it. I think something different now. I think he might have been onto something more specific than comfort. Play. That's the word that Psalm uses. Whom thou hast made to play therein. And I have wondered, more times than I can count in 29 years, whether that word was chosen, by whoever first set that psalm down, in whatever language it started in, with more precision than a frightened modern reader tends to give it credit for. Play, not hunt, not threaten, not destroy. Something ancient, something vast, something that has apparently been in these waters, or aware of these waters, for longer than human memory has any record of, and its relationship to the ocean, and maybe to us, was never framed, in the oldest description we have of it, as one of malice. I don't know if that's true. I want to be honest with you that I don't know if that's true, because everything I actually witnessed in 1997, the ROV going dark, Terry Aldis's eye drifting independently of his own control for 6 hours, that final half-second of a lens being looked back into, could just as easily be read as something closer to warning than to play. But I have decided, in these last months, that I would rather carry the possibility that Walt was right, that whatever we disturbed down there was never truly hostile to us, merely vast and patient, and profoundly misunderstood by 17 frightened men and a handful of scientists doing their best with instruments that were never going to be sufficient to the task, than carry the alternative for whatever time I have left. I want to say something directly to you now, whoever you are watching this, because I have thought a great deal, these past 4 months, about who eventually receives a story like this, and why. If you have made it this far, I suspect you are someone who has already, on your own, independently of anything I've told you tonight, felt some version of what pulled Terry Aldis out of a Sonar shack chair and into a passageway on the worst night of his young life. Some sense that the official version of things you've been handed your whole life doesn't fully account for the size and the strangeness of the actual world underneath it. I am not going to tell you that everything you've ever suspected about hidden things is true, because I don't know what you've suspected, and because a man who just spent 30,000 words trying to be scrupulously honest about the limits of his own knowledge has no business handing you a blank check of validation on subjects he knows nothing about. But I will tell you this. The ocean covers 70% of this planet, and human beings have physically explored, with our own eyes, in any detailed way, something less than 5% of it. And I spent 22 years of my life listening to that overwhelming majority of unexplored darkness through a set of headphones, and I am telling you, as the last honest thing I intend to do with the career that darkness gave me, that there is more in it, listening back, than any government has ever been comfortable letting the rest of us know about. Carol is asleep in the chair beside my bed as I finish this, and I am going to wake her gently in a few minutes, because she worries when she wakes up and finds me alone with my thoughts for too long, and she has earned 20 years of not having to worry about that particular thing, without good reason. My daughter is flying in from Charlotte this weekend, with her daughter, my granddaughter with the purple marker and the construction paper anglerfish, and I intend to tell them a version of this, a gentler version, a version without the 11 seconds of footage or the exact phrasing of a document that tried to reach past my own grave to keep me quiet. Because there is a difference between honesty and cruelty, and I am trying, in whatever time remains, to practice the first without committing the second against the people who love me. To the Navy, if anyone still watching over these matters ever sees this, I served 22 years. I never once, before tonight, violated an oath I took seriously every single day of that service, and I am not violating it now out of anger or carelessness or any desire to embarrass an institution I still, despite everything, love. I am violating it because I am dying, because a document written in a windowless room in Maryland in 1997 tried to claim an authority over my last words that I no longer believe any government has the standing to claim over any man, and because a 12-year-old girl with a purple marker asked her grandfather a simple, honest question about the ocean, and deserved, before he ran out of time to give it to her, something closer to the truth than the silence he'd been carrying for 29 years. Terry, if you ever see this, and some part of me believes you will, because I think you've been waiting almost as long as I have for someone to finally say it out loud. Thank you for walking into that torpedo room. I should have been walking beside you. I have never stopped being sorry that I wasn't. Alan, wherever you are now, I hope somebody finally answered you back too. And to whatever was down there, 36,000 feet below a patch of ocean southwest of Guam, calling out patiently for the better part of a year, before 17 frightened men worked up the courage to answer, I don't know if you're still listening, wherever you went after 1997. But if you are, I want you to know that at least one of the men on that boat has spent every year since trying to understand what you were actually saying, and that I am sorry, for whatever it's worth from a dying man on the surface, that the only answer we ever managed to give you was frightened, clumsy, and far too small for whatever question you were actually asking. This is Senior Chief Michael Rourke, United States Navy, retired. I served aboard the USS Corvina. In July of 1997, off the coast of Guam, we found something at the bottom of the Mariana Trench that was not a whale, and for 29 years, I let a piece of paper convince me that the truest thing that ever happened to me was also the thing I was least permitted to say out loud. I am done being convinced of that. Whatever time I have left, I intend to spend it having finally told the truth, to my family, to whoever is watching this, and, in whatever way a dying man's honesty still counts for anything at all, to the Leviathan itself, wherever in that vast, dark, unmeasured ocean, it finally decided we were not worth calling to anymore.